Hi and welcome to today's video where I will be discussing a great big garbage fire. So today's video is about an article which has been published by Unherd. It's by Debbie Hayton and it serves as what we would call a retconned narrative. That is, it is projecting adult reasons for things back into the life of that adult when he was a child. It's completely inconsistent with what we know about child development, and it's a huge safeguarding issue. So the best thing to do, I think, is to go through it and actually read the article and have a look at what's actually going on. The article's in Unheard. It's by Debbie Hayton, a teacher and transgender campaigner, and it's called My Autogynephilia Story. Autogynephilia, literally to love oneself as a woman, is controversial stuff. Men are not supposed to fancy themselves. At least they weren't when I grew up in the 80s. Back then, the idea that any of us might be sexually aroused by the thought or image of ourselves as a girl was unthinkable. I'm a little bit younger than Mr. Hayton, so I'm not sure what it was like for him growing up. But during the 80s, in my memory, we had people like Boy George of Culture Club, we had Marilyn, we had the entire new romantic movement of Adam Ant and Duran Duran and all these incredible blokes who were very comfortable wearing makeup and frilly clothes and all the rest of it. And some of them very definitely did fancy themselves, and that was very clear. So I don't know where this idea is coming from. It sounds vaguely homophobic. I wonder if Debbie Hayton grew up in a homophobic environment at home. Kathleen Stock recently suggested in Unheard that autogynephilia was a motive for some but not all within the male trans demographic to immerse themselves in the fiction of changing sex. Ray Blanchard, the sexologist who coined the terminology, went further. Last year he told me that in the Western Hemisphere and English-speaking Commonwealth countries, the overwhelming majority of adult natal males presenting with gender dysphoria are of the autogynephilic type. So these are entirely uncontroversial statements here. Kathleen Stock couches it in a much more moderate way than I would by saying that some but not all of the male trans demographic, whereas Ray Blanchard is, clearly he's the guy that defined this terminology and has probably seen more transsexual people than anybody else in practice. And I agree with him. From what I see on social media, autogynephilia is the norm. It isn't the exception. AGP drove my own transsexualism, but in a debate where the condition is simultaneously denied and monstered, it is unsurprisingly also misunderstood. Stock described it as a fetish and suggested that it was likely to be influenced by pornography. While it might exhibit itself in fetishistic behaviour and be fed by porn, my experience of AGP extends back to my earliest memories. If I was not born with this pervading condition, it had gripped me by age 3. Stock described it as a fetish and suggested it was likely to be influenced by pornography, and I think that that's a completely reasonable assumption. Of course, she drew on feminist theory by Sheila Jeffreys, who has written extensively about how autogynephilia is an artifact of a porn addiction in these men. Debbie Hayton is an unreliable narrator about the influence of AGP back in his earliest memories. There is no way that he was aware of this condition at age 3. So for a moment, we're just going to seek into a little bit of child development, because I think it's important to think about what is actually going on when a child is 3. What are their actual cognitive abilities? What's their emotional development? What is actually it like to be 3 years old? How do you see the world that's so different? And we don't have to wonder too much, because thankfully there are lots and lots of resources out there, and certainly qualifying as a teacher or anybody with daily contact with children, you will definitely have been taught about child development. So let's just watch a clip from a video which is on my YouTube playlist for child development, to see what it's like for a 3-year-old to work out what gender some toy is.
Hello.
Okay, right. Are you a boy or a girl?
I'm boy.
How do you know?
Because I got short hair.
What about mummy?
I got mommy a girl.
Why?
Because mommy got long hair.
Okay. Is there anything else that makes you a boy?
Yeah.
What else makes you a boy?
Huh?
So you've got short hair. Is there anything else that makes you a boy? So James, now I'm going to show you a doll, and you need to tell me if it's a boy or a girl. So, here we are. Is this a boy or a girl?
I'm a boy.
How do you know? How do you know it's a boy?
Because they got short hair.
Because he's got short hair. Is there anything else that makes it a boy? Is there anything else that makes it a boy?
Yeah, hands.
He's got hands.
Yeah.
The girls not have hands.
Yeah.
So now, is this a boy or a girl?
A girl.
Why is it a girl?
Because they got. Yeah.
Because he's got a dress on. So it's a girl.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else that makes it a girl?
Yeah.
What else?
Hands.
So this time, James, is this a boy or a girl?
A girl.
Why?
Because they got long hair.
Because he's got long hair.
E.
Is there anything else that makes it a girl?
So first of all, let's talk about Piaget, who, as we know, had these 4 stages of cognitive development. And just for the curious, here are Piaget's stages of cognitive development. There are loads of videos about this if you're interested. And the stage that the child is in this video is called the pre-operational stage, and this is the stage at which the child still shows really concrete thinking. So for instance, a child will, in the famous experiments, a child will tend to choose the drink that's in the tall glass rather than the drink that's in the short glass that's the same volume, because they think that it looks bigger. They can't understand that the quantity is the same in different sized containers, and the same with a squished piece of plasticine is the same size as a ball of plasticine. If it looks like it covers a bigger area, they tend to choose that one. So children at this stage find it very, very difficult to understand that if you change the appearance of something, the essential quality of that thing doesn't change. So at this stage, if a child sees a doll dressed as a woman, a child will think it is actually a woman. The child doesn't think that doll is dressing up as a woman. The child believes that that doll is a woman because a woman means wearing a dress, or a woman means long hair. And you can see this child very deliberately repeating this concept. And if you have children, you will have seen these stages of development in your own children. You know, we are really clear about child development. These things are as solid theories as any theory could be in psychology. This theory has stood for 100 years. So, you know, we have a very, very strong ability to describe the cognitive development of children and how each level provides the foundation for the next level, which ultimately results in a grown adult. Now, we move forward 50 years, and a psychologist came along called Lawrence Kohlberg, who built on the work that Piaget had already established in cognitive development. And Kohlberg developed stages of moral development. If you're interested, here is Kohlberg's theory. And it starts out that you have a very kind of authoritarian belief in doing the right thing because you don't want to get hurt. And as you move through these stages, you end up, hopefully, I mean, not all adults get there, but hopefully you end up at the stage where you can make your ethical decisions about how to act based on universal ethical principles, and you are less constrained by rules or social conventions. You're more able to stand up for what is right. At age 3, we're still operating at a very, very basic level where we are responding to authority figures, attempting to avoid punishment. So a child at this age is very, very responsive to punishment and praise, as we all know as parents. And what the child in the video is demonstrating is that he is applying rules that he feels he's understood from society, that dress is associated with woman and not dress is associated with man. So he's looking to the authority figure to check that his understanding is right, but he's applying the rule, the social rule that he has understood. And that is how we actually socialize children into gender roles. So what I'm trying to get at here is that it's absolutely untrue that Debbie Hayton was either born with AGP or that it had gripped him by age 3. Absolutely impossible for that to have happened, because it's not possible for a child's brain at that age to conceive of such notions. This is an adult perspective being retconned back into the body of that child. More than 50 years later, I can still picture the scene. I was learning to count beyond 20 and quickly picked up the pattern: 30, 40, 50, and the repetition. But by the time we got to 60, a chill ran down my spine. We would soon be at 80. A word sounded similar to tights, clothing that I knew was only for girls. 80 doesn't sound like tights. But, you know, children are not logical the way that we are. I mean, I have no idea if there is a memory that Debbie Hayton is dredging up in order to inform this narrative. But what I can tell you for certain is that the interpretation of this memory is based on the adult Debbie Hayton's needs, desires, cognitive development, sexual desires, sexuality, the whole adult complexity, which is being projected back into the body of a 3-year-old child, a toddler. What I do believe is that at that age, Debbie Hayton was aware of rules, that clothing was for girls or boys. And I suspect that the rules that Debbie Hayton grew up with were relatively rigid, which is often a sign of homophobia, a dislike of gender non-conformity, because we know that gender non-conformity in children is associated with later homosexuality in adults. Why this was such a taboo for me and at such an early age, I don't know. Clearly, I understood the difference between boys and girls. I knew I was a boy, and I knew that we wore different clothes, but I wanted to wear girls' clothes, something I knew was forbidden. I cannot remember being told such things, but nobody had told me how to breathe either, or know how to feel hungry or thirsty, or go to sleep when I was tired. But every other sexually dimorphic species needs to know the difference between the sexes without being schooled on it. Why should human beings be different? Knowing how to breathe, whether you're hungry or thirsty, that's a level of cognitive development which is foundational to everything else. So until we physically learn the interpretation of the information we get from our senses from the world around us. This is the very, very first stage of Piaget's development. That's the basis of everything else. So there's absolutely no way that Debbie Hayton, educated in child development, should be associating decisions around clothing with decisions that are made with such a basic level of human understanding. That is retconning the narrative. The reason why sexually dimorphic species need to know the difference between the sexes is because we mate to procreate. And so every single person that is a member of a sexually dimorphic species has an inbuilt evolutionary ability to tell the difference between the sexes, because we need to know who we could mate with, who we're going to fight with, who we're going to cooperate with. None of this is associated with the social conventions around clothing and shame, which Debbie Hayton brings up several times in this essay, and which I think offers us a fascinating insight into what's part of this complex knot of autogynephilia. Debbie Hayton is telling us that girls' clothes were forbidden. That is a very, very strong statement. Clothes were the issue for me throughout childhood, but I had no sisters, and I had to make do with my own fantasy world. During primary school, however, I stumbled upon 2 opportunities to turn that fantasy into reality. I remember them like oases in a desert. Debbie Hayton is telling us here that he had no sisters, so therefore there were no clothes at home that he could borrow to try on. What he doesn't mention is that he did have a mother, and I wonder why he didn't mention whether or not he was ever tempted to take clothes that belonged to his mother. He describes these opportunities at primary school to cross-dress as oases in a desert, and this is often a feature of narratives of autogynephiles that I've read, that they see these opportunities to cross-dress and they variously describe it as relaxing or as relieving stress or as like this quenching a thirst, oases in a desert. These are very common justifications, rationalizations. But they're adult rationalizations and justifications. They're not childish ones. First, there was a village fete where my ladybird costume involved wearing a tight black jumper and black tights. The red papier-mâché on my back was incidental. Adrenaline overwhelmed me, but I was too ashamed to tell anyone. I was probably aged 6. 3 years later, a school Christmas play offered another cross-dressing opportunity. Nothing special, I was a carol singer, but for some long-forgotten reason the boys were dressed the same as the girls. But by then I was imprisoned by my own fear and never took the message home. My costume was never made, and I played my role in mufti. The description of the ladybird costume is so sweet. I bet Mrs. Hayton handmade it, because back then there weren't fancy dress shops. It was just more unpaid work, frequently for women. Anyway, so Debbie Hayton describes wearing this tight black jumper and black tights at age 6. So by age 6, he's actually moved up in terms of child development stages. And certainly 3 years later, at age 9, he's definitely moved up into the next stage of child development. So let's just take a brief look at what that looks like.
Hi James, how old are you?
5 and I'm going to be 6 soon.
James,
Yeah,
are you a boy or a girl?
boy.
How do you know?
Because I have a willy.
Ah, okay.
Do you see how James is now able to associate the essential quality of his boyhood, that of the fact that he clearly has the genitals associated with the male sex in childhood? he's able to describe that as the justification for his classification as a boy.
Right, James, I'm going to show you a doll now. And I want you to tell me if it's a boy or if it's a girl. You can hold it.
A boy.
Right, how do you know it's a boy?
Because sometimes girls don't really wear shirts.
Okay, so it's clothes.
Yeah.
Anything else that makes it a boy?
No.
Okay, so all on his clothes, yeah?
So when we think about Kohlberg's theory, we see that James is now at the point of conformity and interpersonal accord. So he's now not thinking of social rules as being things that avoid punishment, and he's thinking more in terms of what is the conformist view, what rules have I understood about how society works. So, fairness is very, very important to children at this age. You've got to have exactly the same amount of juice as everybody else, that kind of thing. So social conformity is very, very important. And so this is the age at which children become very fixated around social rules. And you can see that James has got a very complex understanding that girls don't usually wear shirts. So girls could wear shirts, but girls don't generally wear shirts. So he's explaining that he understands the general rule is that girls don't tend to wear suits, but he's also explaining that he understands, which I suspect is due to his upbringing, that girls can wear these clothes.
Right, James, is this a boy or a girl?
A boy.
Why?
Because he's still a boy because he's just wearing a dress.
So if you were to wear a dress,
Yeah.
would you be a boy or a girl?
Boy.
How do you know?
Because I know because my parents told me, and you just wear a dress and you're a boy.
How do you know you're a boy, even if you've got a dress on?
Because you have a willy.
Okay, and that tells you you're a boy?
Yeah.
Okay.
So James is describing how his parents have explained to him that the social rules are this, that girls tend to wear these types of clothes, boys tend to wear these types of clothes, but that you are a boy and you stay a boy because you have the body of a boy, you have the genitals of a boy. We know that you are of the male sex. We know that you will be a father if you have children, not a mother. This boy has clearly been socialized well into reality. I shouldn't laugh, but realistically, this is what children are not being taught. This is basic child development theory. This is not groundbreaking. This theory is 70 years old now. This is not news.
Right, James. Now, is this a boy or a girl?
A boy.
Why?
Because he just has long hair. And some boys just have long hair.
But they're still boys?
Yeah.
Ah. And what if you grew your hair really long?
I'll still be a boy.
Why?
Because I'll just be a boy because you just might get older and then your hair will grow more.
Okay. So if you were born a boy,
Yeah.
what happens?
You just grow up to the teenager or to boy and then you grow up big to a man.
Oh, okay. So can you be a mummy when you're bigger?
No,
Why?
because only girls do that.
Okay. Thanks, mate.
So what I suspect that Debbie Hayton is communicating in this section of the piece is that he grew up in a homophobic environment where the gender roles associated with male dress and female dress were very strictly enforced, and this led to a fascination with items of clothing that were gendered female. This is not evidence of any kind of innate sexual autogynephilia. This is evidence of an adult projecting back into his childhood a justification for his adult behaviour. In those days, an interest in the clothes of the opposite sex was labelled as transvestism, something distinct from transsexualism, a compulsion to be the opposite sex. But in reality, the two conditions are not so easy to separate. Transvestites may have been ridiculed while transsexuals were pitied, but there is truth behind an old joke in the trans community. What's the difference between a transvestite and a transsexual? About 5 years. We know there's no real difference between transvestites and transsexuals because we know that there's nothing that a male person can do to change the fact that they're born, they grow up as a boy, and then as a teenager, and then into a big strong man. Even little James in that last clip could get it. So yeah, that's why that joke is funny, because we know. These days it seems that we are all trans women, which may remove the need for any demarcation, but it also removes the need to think about AGP. However, while language may change, human nature remains the same from generation to generation. In a 2005 study of 2,450 Swedish adults, Langström and Zucker found that almost 3% of men reported at least one episode of transvestic fetishism. I wonder how many more did not report their furtive activities. Whatever the truth, this behaviour appears to be rather more common than the 0.3% to 0.7% tentatively estimated by the UK government in 2018. First of all, it is funny to me, a woman, how interesting men find themselves to be, because fetishistic behaviour to me is not that interesting. Yeah, I suspect it is more common than we think, especially because we now have a porn-saturated population of men, and that's probably affecting human sexual behaviour in all sorts of dreadful ways. But it doesn't mean that it's innate. My experience alone suggests that boys wrestle with AGP long before puberty, but it was during adolescence when my long-running fantasy, usually of waking up to find myself magically transformed into the other sex, became a compulsion to start buying female clothes. By the time I was 16, I would travel to neighbouring towns, buy what I could, and squirrel my purchases away in intricate, secure hiding places. Being discovered was the most shameful thing I could imagine. At no point did pornography play a part. This was the 80s and I had no access to it. The compulsion came from within. My thoughts were driven by my own nature. My experience suggests that boys wrestle with AGP long before puberty. No, because sexuality doesn't emerge until puberty. And then it may take several years for it to fully develop. There's absolutely no way, as we can see from the evidence of 100 years of child development studies, there's no evidence that normal sexual development of children involves displaying fetishistic behaviour pre-puberty. I would add that any behaviour of overtly sexual nature in children that are pre-puberty is a massive safeguarding alert and would require immediate referral to your safeguarding lead at school and then on to your local authority duty officer, because that's a child that is potentially in need. That is a child that is potentially at risk of sexual abuse, specifically, whether that's physical abuse, whether they've been exposed to inappropriate images. That child is not developing normally. We know, because of all of these studies, because we know that children don't display any sexuality, let alone fetishistic sexuality, pre-puberty. Dr. Hayton, I don't believe that you don't know this as an educationalist. The description of squirreling away purchases, it's all wrapped up in shame, in guilt, in all of these difficult emotions which are becoming entwined as this 16-year-old begins to explore transvestism. These feelings of shame and guilt are becoming knotted up with sexual expression, and it's possible that this heralds the start of his journey into autogynephilia. Truthfully, I do think that in kind of the later teenage years, adolescent boys have very, very strong levels of testosterone, very, very strong sex drive, don't often have any kind of avenue to express it with girls. So are often retreating into a fantasy world, whether that is nowadays they might be looking at images of rape and sexual abuse on the internet. Previously, they might have looked at images of rape and sexual abuse in magazines or on video. Before that, they might have peeped at doors, at people or into windows, or they might have peeped at girls in the shower or in the changing rooms. But equally, there are clearly a small number of boys who are exploring themselves with this kind of self-focused idea of dressing up as the object of their desire. Life is very different for children growing up today, and not always in a good way. Transitioning was never an option for me as a child, so it was futile to go beyond dreaming about it. Instead, my energies were directed into my studies and my relationships, and keeping my AGP well hidden. The mental stress was incessant. The way that children are growing up today is not always great, I agree. But I do think it's a big shame that Debbie Hayton describes pouring his energies into his studies and relationships as a negative thing, whereas that is probably the most positive part of this whole entire story, is that despite having these unusual thoughts about dressing up and deriving sexual pleasure from images of himself dressed up in women's clothing, he was nevertheless functional enough to go to university, gain a PhD, find a lovely lady to marry and settle down with. That is a hopeful story. That's as good as it gets for humans. But I endured. I eventually married a woman, and we had 3 children. Those 4 people mean the world to me. Autogynephilia drifted in and out of remission, but it never took over, at least not until the internet connected me to other people who had transitioned and had made it work. These were not the exotic transsexuals that I had read about in the Sunday People, high-life celebs who had sex changes in Casablanca. They were people just like me, engineers, medics, teachers even, who had gone to their GPs to ask for a referral to an NHS gender clinic. When I knew that medical and surgical transition was possible, it rapidly became irresistible. Autogynephilia doesn't go into remission in the way that cancer does. Autogynephilia is known for binge and purge cycles. So it is so bound up with shame and guilt that these men cannot resist their sexual urge to do this, indulge this fetishistic behaviour. They gather all the props that they want, they indulge in this behaviour, and then they come up against a barrier of some kind, whether that's a partner that says, I am not going to do this anymore, and I am going to leave you if you continue to do this. Or whether it's, something is found or something is nearly found, the shame and the guilt take over, and that person goes, right, that's it, I am never doing that again. They get rid of everything, and it's like an addict that's given up everything but not actually sought psychological treatment, and so eventually they go back to whatever the addiction is, or they move on to a different addiction. And for an autogynephile, the urge remains and eventually will be indulged in again. And this has been well described. What he describes then about the internet connecting him to other people who had transitioned and had made it work. What he's talking about here is people that made demands and got what they demanded. And he's clearly saying, I'm not talking about the super rich or the super famous or those people. I'm talking about ordinary everyday people. And as soon as this fetishist was told that it was possible to live his fetish 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no one will stop you. It's on the NHS. It's free. And there are loads of organisations which will provide coercive control so that your wife has nowhere to turn, because every single organisation that is set up to support the families of people who wish to transition will tell her that this is, a civil right, that you have the right to do this, that you have the right to indulge in your transvestic fetishism 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, involving your children, involving your wife, involving strangers, involving unwilling, non-consenting people. The definition of a fetish is its sexual behaviour that involves non-consenting people. That's what makes it a fetish and not a sexuality. So for an autogynephile, the reason why it's a fetish and not a sexuality is that the display of the autogynephilia and the shame and guilt that's associated with it, all of those are socially mediated. They come because of contact with other people. Other people approve of the display of autogynephilia. That gives them euphoria, which is a euphemism, as we know. Other people disapprove. Perhaps a lady says mean words to you on the internet. Then that involves the shame and the guilt. And that is also associated with the sexual thrill. And they get euphoria, which is a euphemism. These are sexual fetishists. And what he's describing here is that he was given permission to inhabit this fetish 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that was irresistible to him. But what opened up to me in midlife now beckons to children. I worry about both sexes. In her superb book, Irreversible Damage, Abigail Shrier explores on the transgender contagion among teenage girls. But what about boys, particularly those struggling with AGP? These days they might be adorned with new labels, trans girls, but the condition is the same. Who is looking out for them? Who is counselling those who come forwards? And how are they being counselled? I cannot do it. I'm no therapist, and I firmly believe all AGP adults, indeed all transsexuals, should stay clear. We come with our own baggage, and children need to be able to focus on their own issues when they see a counsellor. He tells us he worries about both sexes. Yeah, so do I, but particularly girls, because it's girls that are vulnerable to boys, whereas boys are not vulnerable to girls in the same way. He talks about Abigail Shrier's book and then worries about the boys struggling with AGP. As we've established, that's an adult framework for a fetish. it is not appropriate to apply it to boys. The condition is not the same. The condition that middle-aged men have is not the same condition that teenage girls have. It's not even the same condition that teenage boys have. Very different. And he's absolutely right that there's absolutely no place for fetishistic adults in the treatment of children and teenagers who need to be treated in a framework that, first of all, holds safeguarding, like preeminent, and secondly, is fully informed with everything that we know about child development. Otherwise, it's not treatment. When I was young, I coped. Because I had to cope. What alternative was there? But it would have helped me to know what was really going on. The tragedy is that the current generation of AGP boys are none the wiser. Either they are cooped up behind the same walls of shame and guilt that constrained me 40 years ago, or they have been affirmed as trans girls, or they are simply at a loss to understand themselves, feeling like an introvert among a party of extroverts. These boys need help to understand themselves. Let's not amplify their daydreams. Fantasy does not become reality. But let's not embarrass or monster them either. We need to be honest. Autogynephilia is a psychological condition that we just have to live with. Some may end up transitioning in the end. We cannot put that particular internet genie back in the box. But that is a decision for adults to take, not children. If first do no harm, then second, let them at least grow up. Is anti-safeguarding and is just not informed by child development. You cannot apply these adult labels to children. We covered this in a previous video, this concept of gender adultification, and made an analogy that it was similar in some ways to a racist adultification, which we saw in the case of child Q. And again, this is the same thing. This is gender adultification again. I agree. Fantasy does not become reality. That's it. But let's not embarrass or monster them either. They shouldn't feel embarrassed. They shouldn't feel ashamed. There is nothing shameful about having any feelings as a child. You cycle through all sorts of different feelings and thoughts, and none of them should be considered shameful. But shame seems to be very, very tied up in this psychological condition that we just have to live with. I don't agree that we just have to live with it. I don't agree with that. I don't agree that we have to live with any fetishistic behaviour. We are quite capable of being boundaried as adults and saying that there are some things that are not suitable to be expressed in public, where unsuspecting persons, children, strangers could be drawn into a performance, a play, an interaction that they do not consent to be part of. He says some may end up transitioning in the end. We cannot put that particular internet genie back in the box. I don't see why not. It used to be the case that these cases were incredibly rare. You'd never meet anybody in your ordinary life, you know, really, really, really rare, because what you're embarking on is so crackers and has such a low rate of any form of success. You know, the ability to blend in is just, it's never going to be yours. You know, you have to have a lot of counselling before deciding to completely blow up all prospect for having a satisfying partnership, or, you know, relationships with your neighbours and people that go to the same church, because people will back away from people who are displaying fetishes in public. It's not something people want to expose their children to, you know. But I do agree that's a decision for adults to take and not children. I agree with that, and in fact his finishing thought that we should definitely be letting children grow up into adults before they make these incredibly final decisions. I agree completely. They are not decisions that are suitable to be made by children, and we certainly shouldn't be putting children in a position where they are developing an identity surrounding these decisions from the age of 3. No, we're not doing that. So I am very, very glad to have got through that article. Overall conclusions. Well, as ever, some absolutely diamond women on Twitter have already said most of what I would want to say. First of all, this tweet. Georgia says, beware the retconned narrative. This article flies against all consensus on child development. Please read some Piaget and some Kohlberg, Dr. Hayton. We are all unreliable narrators of our own lives. Child development's pretty well understood compared to lots of other fields of psychology, and it's really, really important that we don't abandon all of this human endeavour that has led to this knowledge just because some new and shiny theory has come along in the last 5 minutes. Brilliant point, this one made by Georgia X Cross. Georgia says, Dr. Hayton is ascribing motivations to childhood memories that are incongruent with consensus on child development, including self-recognition of sex and sexual feelings. We all do this to some extent, not usually about sex because few develop paraphilias. It's called retconning. Georgia talks about this idea of retconning, this idea that we're putting our own interpretation on events that happened many, many years ago when we were children, but we're doing that using an adult lens, which is not informed by child development and by safeguarding. Marjorie said, claiming that 3-year-old little boys who are not attracted to stereotypical masculine toys or clothes may be gripped by emergent AGP paraphilias is a desperate move. We do not need to destigmatise men's paraphilias. These harm children. Stop. Couldn't agree more with Marjorie there. There is absolutely nothing that we need to be labelling a 3-year-old with in terms of an adult sexuality. It's completely inappropriate. It is in fact harmful to children to label them in this way. We do not want to lift any of these children out of the safeguarding frameworks that we've developed. We want to apply those frameworks consistently. And I look forward to us all agreeing to do that. Dr. Blanchard said, I highly recommend this autobiographical article on autogynephilia and autogynephilic gender dysphoria. There is one significant fan of the piece, and that is Dr. Ray Blanchard, who issued this pronouncement. In conclusion, I've said it about 5 times now in this video. We have really good understanding of child development. We have a very firm foundation in safeguarding practice in this country. We need to avoid this gender adultification, this lifting of children outside of these frameworks of child development and safeguarding, and retconning these adult narratives back onto them. We must allow children the time and the space that they need to develop in their own way and in their own good time. When they become adults, perhaps they make decisions that lead them down a path that we wouldn't accept when they were 3. When they're adults, they get to make those decisions. But as children and young people, as responsible adults, we must ensure that they are safeguarded, that their future fertility is safeguarded, that their future sexuality is safeguarded, that their future health and wholeness is safeguarded. We need to stop harming these children. So thanks for watching the video today. Really appreciate your company. If you haven't subscribed yet, smash that subscribe button. Consider leaving me a like or a dislike. Join the conversation and leave a comment. It's always lovely to chat with you. If you wish to support me practically, I will be very, very grateful. Thank you very, very much. My PayPal details are in the description box, where you will also find all the links to the materials used in today's video. It's a bit of a long one. It might end up being split over a couple of days, but I do hope you enjoyed it. So take care, and until the next time,